everyone, my name is Carrie and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a review of The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri, which is the first book in the Burning Kingdoms trilogy. The second book, The Oleander's Sword, actually comes out this August, and I believe the third book is set to come out sometime in potentially 2023, and it's currently untitled, so we'll have to wait and see for that one. I've never done a video review before, so I'm first going to go over the 6 parts I've broken this review down into. I'm also going to be including chapters down at the bottom of the screen so that, you know, if you care more about hearing about the characters than the writing, you'll be able to jump around as you please, because I understand obviously some people might be interested in only certain parts of the story, or some people might be interested in the whole review. So the 6 parts I've broken this down into are part 1, which is the summary, part 2, which is world building and the magic/belief systems, part 3 is about all of the characters, part 4 is the writing and pacing of the story, and part 5 are the main ideas and big themes. Part 6 is the conclusion, which is going to be not only concluding my thoughts on the book, but also the conclusion of the video. And while this review is not intentionally meaning to spoil any aspects of the story, I will be including spoiler banners like this one here, which is your first example, and I will leave that banner up until the end of potentially spoilery topics. Part 3 and part 5 are probably going to be the ones where you'll see those spoiler warnings at. Now let's get started with the summary. So this is just going to be a basic synopsis of the book. And I was honestly really shocked that when I picked up the book for the first time, the synopsis is really short, and I now see why this is done, because there's so much that is happening in this book, and that short synopsis is a great gateway into this whole world. So in this story, we first meet Malini, who is a princess of Parijatvipa, and she is being sent into exile in this other region of the empire named Ahiranya. The reasoning for her being sent into exile is a bit questionable. It is seemingly because she refused to be a sacrifice in this religious ceremony that her brother was doing, but it's kind of unclear exactly what the purpose of this ceremony was. So she is sent to be imprisoned in this religious temple in Ahiranya, and this is where our other main character comes into play. Our other main character is Priya, who is a maidservant in the regent's home in Ahiranya, and she is then relocated to the temple that Malini is imprisoned in to work as a servant there, and then eventually work directly with Malini as her personal servant. So through this, they become kind of friends, and our story unfolds from there, because while there is much more to this story than just Priya and Malini, they are still definitely the focus of it and the starting off point for this world. Now let's discuss what exactly is this world that they are living in and what sort of fantastical elements are a part of it. So this world was actually inspired by India, and so there are different city-states across this country, and there are also different languages spoken in these different regions, different religions, a lot of distinct cultures in these various regions. They are all ruled as this one empire called Parijatvipa, and this empire is ruled by Malini's brother, who is Emperor Chandra. Now most of the story actually takes place in Ahiranya, which is this regional territory, which I will show you on the map. It is right here. This is the map of the empire, and this is Ahiranya down here. And so this region is basically a colonized territory of the empire. The people there are deemed second-class citizens. They are not allowed to speak their native language. They are not allowed to participate in their native culture unless they are events approved by the regional government. The regional government are all filled with Parajiti noblemen, and none of the reigning regions there have been Ahiranyi. There's a lot of tension in this region, but also tension as a whole with the empire, and this is mainly due to religious differences between different regions of the empire. So let's take a look at the magic and belief systems of this empire, and I use magic and belief a little interchangeably in this because most of the belief systems in this world do have some aspect of magic within them. So in this book there are 3 main religions that we are told about through this book. 2 out of the 3 are elaborated on in a good amount of detail. There is one that doesn't receive as much development as the other 2, and I think there is a reason why. So we're going to talk about that one last. First, let's talk about the temple children. So this is a faith that was native to Ahiranya, and the followers believed in these beings called Yaksa, who they believe essentially created the world. There is something about this religion that is very much connected to Earth, the natural world, being in tune and one with the environment. It manifests in the temple children as specific powers related to the natural world, which is really fascinating to see play out in this story. This religion is very heavily suppressed in Ahiranya. This suppression is actually a big driving force for a lot of the rebel groups that are kind of having these squabbles with the empire, and that ultimately kind of cause a lot more friction in the region. So the other faith that we receive quite a bit of development on is the nameless god, and that is actually practiced in the city-state of Srugna and Alor, which are, there's Srugna and there's Alor. So you can see it's kind of this whole bottom half of the empire. The faith of the nameless god is a belief system where there is a god who provides prophecies to people that dictate the course of fate. In this religion, people are not named like we would name a baby right after birth. Instead, they go without a name and are given a prophecy that either describes their fate or the fate of someone who they need to tell this prophecy to, or some of them are given what's called death names, which is where they are told the way that they will die, and it's meant to serve a specific purpose. That's a big thing about this religion, is that these prophecies and names are very intentional. There is a specific purpose for when and why they are revealed to people, because they are meant to be kept in secret until there is this sense that this prophecy is already set in stone and being fulfilled. So it's a very interesting concept of how and why people are named in this faith. And this is one where I could see a correlation to Abrahamic faiths, in the sense that there is a God that gives prophecies to people who become, in a sense, prophets and spread the word of God. I'm not exactly sure if that was the intention. I will say that I am definitely not familiar enough with the complexity of religious diversity, the various religions that exist within India, to comment on like, yes, this for sure is meant to represent this religion. But as someone who was raised within an Abrahamic religion, I do see that there could be that correlation with this story. Now, the third and final religion is the faith of the mothers, and this is technically the religion of the empire. This is the religion of the emperor, and he has essentially mandated this as the kingdom's religion. Whether by choice or by force, it is expected to be practiced throughout the entire empire. This is where a lot of tensions start to arise, because there is no room for another faith to be practiced. This faith of the mothers is very confusing, and I almost want to say that's intentional. I feel like we weren't given a lot of development of this religion, because the way this story ends, it very much is going to play a part in the next book. However, the way that it's described in this first book could definitely be a reference to the kind of delusion and tyrannical nature that Emperor Chandra has. It's very unclear how this concept of immolation, that is an essential part of the faith, is actually put into practice. Every time this act of immolation is talked about in this book, it always seems to be under a different context, and I think that's really representative of how Emperor Chandra just kind of manipulates the religion to his will, and it's also reinterpreted by different people in different places, and that comes with its own issues when you have a religion that's been forced upon people that may not actually be adhering to the belief system itself. Now, the origins of the faith of the mothers is also a bit confusing, because it very much seems like this has spurned off from the temple children. The Yaksa are somehow related to the founding of the faith of the mothers, but again, it's unclear as to what extent that played a role. So now let's talk about the characters. So first we have Malini, and she was a very unlikable character. I'm not exactly sure if that was intentional or not, because I felt like a lot of her character is purposely withheld from the reader, which is something I didn't really like in this, because it was very hard to understand her personality, her motivation, her feelings for certain things. It made her just seem uncaring and also not really useful to this story. I didn't really understand for the majority of this book what role she was supposed to be playing in this. You could argue that it's to see her interactions with Priya, but I don't think that's a strong enough case to build off of what we get from her. However, I do like where we see her grow after that like 50 to 75% mark, and seeing the potential in her at the end of this story. I do think that she is a character that's finally starting to find her place in the story, and I'm interested to see where it's going to go from here. Then we have Priya, who is one of my favorite characters in this. I really loved her character arc. There were definitely times where she was very frustrating, especially in the choices she makes and her ability to kind of forgive and forget a bit too easily in this story. But I think it's also very much authentic to who she is as a person and her experiences, which have been very traumatic, that have left her kind of always searching for something or someone. I love the way that she grows through this book. I'm really excited to see her story continue on. Next, I'm going to be talking about a character where there will be spoilers. So this character is Ashok, who is first presented as this rebel group leader, but then it's revealed that he's actually Priya's brother, who she thought was dead. I had so many issues with this character, and mainly just that I don't feel like he needed to be a part of this story. I think that he was very much there just to stir the pot with Priya and Bhumika, who is a character I will be discussing next. It was more of just a convenient storyline that helped set up this world and this first conflict. But really the biggest conflict of this story didn't need him. Like, there were still other things going on outside of his storyline that could have very much affected events in a similar way, and it just didn't feel like he needed to be this character that was so close to Priya. But this integration of him as Priya's brother just never fully made sense to me, because so she is abandoned by him and he never came back for her, and in his sections he always is talking about how his only care for Priya is how he can use her to his ends. Also, his death in this is just so convenient. Like, he is just basically like absolved of everything, and I think that that was really my biggest issue here, is that he never actually faces consequences besides his death for like what he's done, and even that isn't an intentional consequence. It's something that's unintentionally done. And I felt like the way his character was written, we were supposed to forgive him, we were supposed to redeem him, and I don't think he deserved that. He did some truly horrible and violent things in this book. That's where I really had problems with this, is that I feel like Priya never fully got to know how horrible he was, and a part of that is her own blinders, but also that so much is just withheld from her in terms of the cruelty that he was also committing even before the Temple Children massacre. Because Bhumika points out that there were times in their childhood where he was extremely violent and problematic, and it was overlooked even by the temple elders. So again, he's never faced consequences. He's just a sociopath. And yeah, so for me, I just did not care for his character. I felt like he didn't add anything to the story except annoyance. And the last character I'm going to talk about is Bhumika. Bhumika was my favorite character in this book. I love the way that she is slowly revealed to the reader, and the way that she just kind of approaches things. I think that she is one of the most reasonable and logical characters in this book. I also love that, you know, when we're first introduced to her in the story, she's like 8 or 9 months pregnant, and she's often dismissed by a lot of men in this story as, you know, being this weak, pregnant woman, and she really fights back at that and shows that you don't have to choose between being a mother and being powerful. And the way that she brings those two worlds together in this story is really so wonderfully done, and it's lovely to see a mother who is so strong, not just as a mother, but also as so many other aspects of her identity, and that she has an independent identity outside of just being a mom. Definitely one of my favorite characters. I will be talking a little bit more about her in the main themes and big ideas section, because there's a lot more to her character that is related to the overarching themes of this work. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the relationship between Priya and Malini, because this is a sapphic work, and I have to say, I was not really sold on the romance. I think that Priya deserved a lot better than Malini. I don't know if it's just because I didn't really fully believe Malini ever. This goes back to, I just feel like we are left in the dark about so much of her actual thoughts and feelings for things. And there are a lot of times also where in her story, she talks about manipulating Priya, and it's unclear exactly when that is used as a defense mechanism to hide her feelings, or when it is just used like in all seriousness. And it felt very much like an exploitative relationship. Also, their relationship is very much formed out of trauma bonding, and I found that a bit problematic considering the environment and the state of mind that both of them are in this story. Now, I will say that I also found it hard to believe, because for so long the romance is just an afterthought. Like, there is barely any mention of a romance between them, and then when it happens, it feels very much like out of the blue, insta-lovey, and there is just like almost this obsessive nature to it, which I think could definitely come from the trauma bonding aspects of this relationship. But it was just really weird to see this play out because I was like, this just doesn't feel like an authentic relationship. Now let's discuss the writing and the pacing. So I really liked the writing in this story. I think that nothing felt unintentional in the writing. Like, I didn't feel like we were wasting page space or like there were unnecessary details added. I felt like the writing was very much upfront about things and got to the point of things without feeling like overly simplified language. There were also these really amazing monologues that weren't like super long monologues, like just really well timed in the story that still felt like authentic dialogue and not just like someone getting a soapbox moment. Now, pacing wise, I have to be upfront. I was warned before this book that the first 150 to 200 pages are very much world building, slower paced, setting really the foundation of the book and also of the series up. And I'm so glad that I knew that because, to be honest, had I not, I think I would have DNF'd because it is such a slow pacing for the first like 200 pages. There's not a lot happening. It is very much just setting up the background of this world and of where the story is going to be going. This was actually a book club pick, and a lot of people in our book club ended up DNFing this because of how slow the pacing was in the beginning. So I think it's one of those where I guess on one hand you could argue that it might weed out some readers that might not be as invested in the story, but on the other hand it could also be limiting the accessibility to other readers who just want the story to kind of move along a little bit earlier. Also, it definitely has to do with if people prefer characters over plot, because characters are going to be so much bigger of an aspect in that first like half of the story versus the plot moving forward, because the plot really only picks up about halfway through the book. For me, that wasn't as big of an issue because I was aware of it. I was happy sticking it out because I was enjoying the writing and seeing these characters. But I understand for other people, that lack of real forward marching plot is going to be a big hindrance to the reading experience. My final comment on the writing in this is that I really love that Tasha Suri chose a multi-POV narration style because it worked so well in the story, not just in fleshing out the characters because we get their different perspectives of things and we get insight into their minds and how they are processing things, but also we get these really amazing chapters from like someone who is experiencing the consequences of choices that are being made. And I found those so amazing to include in this story. I think it worked really well at rounding out the entire story because it felt like we were getting all these different perspectives. These choices that are being made, these actions that are being put into motion do have real world effects for people who are kind of caught in the crossfire. Finally, let's discuss the overarching themes and the main ideas of this book. So there are two big concepts that I'd like to discuss. The first is the role and power of undervalued and overlooked women, and the other is colonialism. So I'm gonna start with the role and value of women in this story. So this world is a very patriarchal society. I think a crucial theme in this story is how the women that are often undervalued and overlooked in this story are really the ones that hold the tangible power, that have the ability to take their fate into their own hands and do what needs to be done. We see this play out in different ways in our three main female characters of Priya, Malini, and Bhumika, and how each of them have so much more power and control than we're really aware of when we're first introduced to them. I kind of like how that unfolds throughout the story because, you know, speaking from someone with a history background, I think that it is very reflective of history and how a lot of times the history of women is often forgotten about, and it's only become a more recent field of study and highlighting the many ways that women played crucial roles in the course of history. And I think that's definitely supposed to be what we're taking away from this, is that, you know, there are women in these kingdoms, even if it's a patriarchal society, who are changing it, who are doing the work to make the society progress and to call out the problematic aspects of these religions and these tyrannical men. There's a really amazing line in this that Bhumika says a few times where she constantly is talking about how the reason that she has this kind of like network of people that like filter her information and things is because no one really cares about a maidservant. Maidservants overhear any and everything, and they get all of the gossip, all of the tea, because no one thinks anything of them. They don't value them. And so that puts them in a unique position to get information, to take that information and pass it along to people where there are after effects and changes and movements that spring up from this information. And I think it's so crucial to understand as a reader that those are the characters we need to value the most, because they are truly the most important in this story. And most of the men in this story cannot rival even a fraction of the power that the women are holding. Now, the other theme that I wanted to talk about is colonialism. And in this story, we see this most prevalent in Ahiranya, where there has very much been this forced colonization of people. Something I find interesting are the characters of Ashok, Priya, and Bhumika, who were all temple children, all raised in a society that deems them as second-class citizens and that has stigmatized them in different ways, and how their own traumatic experiences has shaped the way that they see the path forward for Ahiranya. In my opinion, I think that each of those characters represents a different perspective of a colonized person. So with Priya, we see that she is not very satisfied with the Parajiti government. She agrees that it is problematic, but she doesn't really think that rebellion or revolution is going to solve anything, and she doesn't want there to be anything that totally upends the system, because first, she doesn't really know what her place would be. If that happens, she would no longer be in the region's employ. She would be basically on her own again. She wouldn't have anyone there for her. But also, she has other hesitations, because her experiences pre this temple massacre are now tainted by this very traumatic incident that happened, and she really can't reconcile that with what exactly a world without this Parajiti government would look like, because for her it is filled with a lot of emotions that she just hasn't processed and might not be ready to process. You could say that she's passive as a colonized person because of how much trauma she's had to carry and how much she is just so scared of any big change again, because it's so much unknown for her. And for her, she needs things that are structured and organized by someone else so that it takes away that sense of anxiety for her. And then on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, we see Ashok, who I believe he's meant to represent an extremist. He is very much willing to resort to violence and bloodshed if it means that Ahiranya will be free. But similar to other extremists, he doesn't have any feasible plan of what to do after Ahiranya is free. He doesn't have a good grasp of not only just the regional politics of the different rebel groups and the beliefs of like the everyday people, but also of these bigger tensions in the empire and the practicalities of being an independent city-state when your city-state is so dependent on the empire for other things. So you see that he's so jaded by his own motivations that he doesn't actually have a plan to make it work. There's this really amazing quote from Bhumika in this book that talks about why Ashok's dreams are never going to see fulfillment. She says, "He wants a return to the old Ahiranya. He's chasing a dream, a mirage, of a time when Ahiranya was isolated and alone and strong. How many hundreds upon hundreds of years ago was that? He wants a world that can't be forged without blood and death and sacrifice. In that way, he's no different from the emperor." I think that that is a great point, that Ashok in his extremism is just as bad as the extremist policies of the emperor. They are two sides of the same sword. Ashok refuses to recognize that he is just as problematic in nature for Ahiranya, and that when you have these big ambitious dreams but no way to actually guarantee the safety of the people and the stability of their lives, it's just not going to work out in the way that he expects. And this is where I find it interesting how Bhumika plays a part in this story, because Bhumika is definitely representative of what we would consider a decolonization mindset. Bhumika very much believes that Ahiranya should be free and that there are ways to go about that, but there has to be consideration for the people already living there, and the fact that the people living there are not just Ahiranyi anymore. There are also Parajiti and other people from other parts of the empire that live in this region, and they have to be accounted for. You can't just blindly murder a bunch of people just because they're not Ahiranyi. And that's where I think the decolonization comes in, because she does think that it no longer needs to be a part of this empire, but there has to be practical changes to make it thrive on its own, and to make it happen in a way that provides the least amount of bloodshed and violence to people that have already experienced that and already been traumatized by the colonization itself. She knows that this is not the path forward for a better Ahiranya, but just trading one crown for another. And I love how we see these dynamics play out through these different characters, and how there is all this tension, but also how this echoes a lot of movements that we're even seeing in the present day around the world as different countries are battling this and different former colonized territories are still grappling with the effects of colonization and decolonization efforts. Now, on to my conclusion. Overall, I don't think the Jasmine Throne was a perfect 5 out of 5 stars for me. I think that I did have some issues with the necessity of certain things being included in the story, as well as certain aspects that felt a little bit underdeveloped. However, I still really enjoyed the story, and I found so many things in this that I'm still deconstructing and analyzing even now. There are so many different ways that people can interpret events and characters in this. I really love a book that gets you so involved in the story, but also when you take a step back, there are so many different things that you can break down and analyze. And yeah, I just love that aspect to this. And I think that this story just worked so well in the way that it was told. And it created such a great foundation for where this world can go from here. And I'll definitely be picking up the second book because I think there are a lot of ways that this second book could go. And I'm interested to see how exactly these characters are going to grow, but also this world may be expanded, or we may find out more information that fleshes out the story, the world building, the religions even more. So that concludes my review of the Jasmine Throne. If you have read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts on my topics in the description down below, or your individual perspectives of how you interpreted certain things in this book, because I would love to discuss this more. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Happy reading. Bye.